everyone. Welcome to our SALISES webinar series. This series today begins with a special speaker series by one of our major clusters at SALISES, the SALISES Rural and Agriculture Research Development Cluster, chaired by Dr. Patricia Northover. I'm Dr. Kevin Williams. I'm a senior research fellow at SALISES here. Our moderator today is Dr. Sylvia Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is a senior lecturer at the Biotechnology Center, UII Mona campus. She earned her double major degree in botany and geography and a PhD in biotechnology at UII, and she's presently the leader of the Medicinal Plant Research Group at the Biotechnology Center. Dr. Mitchell, it's over to you as the moderator.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to our new series. And it's a pleasure to do this part of the proceeding. A few housekeeping matters first. We have IT support from, if you look in the list there, Richard Leach. He is the data bank manager at SALISES. And we also have a postgrad student, Christina Daughtry, who is giving us support as well. We would like you, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A section. That way we can see which questions have been answered and which are not. If you put it in the chat, we don't have that ability. Nevertheless, if you put it in the chat, we can still move it over to the question and answers section. A few more things. If you are talking, of course, you unmute your mic. We're going to ask you to mute your mic until then. If you boot it off, just rejoin, and any other matters we will deal with as we go ahead. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Patricia Northover. She is a graduate of the University of Cambridge and the University of the West Indies. She's a development economist, economic philosopher, and senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies. And you'll know that better as SALISES. So we don't have to say it out each time. And that is, of course, at UWI Mona. Dr. Northover shares the SALISES research cluster, chairs it, and this one is, the acronym is SRAD, and that stands for Sustainable Rural and Agricultural Development. There is a website that you can go to. You can Google SALISES and SRAD and it will take you there. And she also chairs the Institute's Sustainable Futures Policy Brief series. She is the co-producer of 2 films on the sugar industry in Jamaica, an adult documentary entitled Sugarcane, Recycling, Sweetness and Power in Modern Jamaica, 2017. And that is also can be made available. There's a link at Facebook. And Miss Sugar, 2017, an animated TV series for children. Miss Sugar has been recognized in the 2020 selection of Best Animation Children's TV Series by the International Film Festival in Germany. There's a link there as well. So lots of links. Her current research projects center on food systems and the decolonial knowledge practices for sustainable development. We will get used to all of these words. We will get used to the subject area. We are going to be doing this series on a regular basis, so look out for the ones in the future. For now, I am going to turn over to Dr. Northover for her to share what she has to share with us today. So over to you, Doc.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sylvia. And Kevin, thank you for chairing the SALISES seminar series. And big up to everyone who made the time to be here today. Welcome. And I hope you do benefit from the few thoughts that I have to share with you on food systems in crisis, vital imperatives, contradictions and vital imperatives. So let me begin. I will begin by sharing my screen and my PowerPoint. Okay, so there I am live on the Zoom platform. Just wanted to say that this initiative, as noted, is coming out of the Rural Research Cluster at SALISES, University of the West Indies. SALISES is a regional institute that has both graduate studies and policy and research on issues related to development, with special reference to small states. But we also have a global agenda to look at contradictions and the processes and policies needed for sustainable lives, livelihoods, well-being. So in the effort to build a broader public discourse, our research cluster decided to entertain these speaker series. And the thematic that we're looking at in the speaker series for 2021 is COVID-19 Discourses on Fleeing the Plantation, a modern Marronage for sustainable food systems. And I'm leading off. I was pushed to do this, to set this.
Gently.
Yes, I know. To set the stage for our conversations. And I hope that I do justice to our research cluster, which has, I think, over 40 persons now. And we have a steering committee of around 14 persons, including youth, private sector, and the academy, an international interdisciplinary grouping. And I'll briefly introduce the SRAD cluster and our objectives at the end of my talk so you can get a sense of what it is that we're trying to do. So for the presentation today, I'm going to be focusing on this issue of food systems in crisis. So good afternoon again. Today, I'd like first to dwell with the idea that food is failing us in order to understand exactly what this means, from whose standpoint, and what is to be done. In brief, I will argue that our fundamental food systems crisis calls for 3D thinking. That is, thinking that is divergent, disruptive, and decolonial. This form of thinking is considered necessary in order to challenge and flee from the untenable neoliberal and reformist agenda in food politics that sustains saving clauses, silver bullets, and a sublime forgetfulness that acts to preserve the plantation logic of racialized food regimes. In January 2020, a commentary in the Nature and Food Journal on planet-proofing the global food system, authored by Johann Rockstrom et al., a team of leading scientists attached to the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany and the Biodiversity International in France, frankly put forward the position that food is failing us. Indeed, this is the overwhelming consensus from a variety of critical stakeholders, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which highlighted the centrality of agriculture and land use systems to the dynamics of contemporary climate change in their 2019 report. To the conservative US think tank, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, as expressed in the opinion piece by Jason Hickel in August 2019, entitled "The Global Food Crisis is Here." Indeed, Isabella Cazil, director of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, CIGAR, its Water, Land, and Ecosystem program, in a 2019 blog on the Scientific American Network, stressed that, and I quote, "It is not only, It is not only a climate crisis that we have on our hands, it's a full-blown planetary emergency. And agriculture is both a source of the problem and a potential solution. She continues to note that the decisions made in the next few decades will have huge ramifications for the future of our planet, and getting our food systems right is at the heart of this, end of quote. However, while this food systems crisis is indeed planetary, it is obvious that certain bodies, spaces, and places that are rooted in a history of colonial and racial violence do bear the brunt of these crises. Thus, as noted in the 2020 Global Report on Food Crisis in 2019, that is, before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were 135 million persons in 55 countries who were in food crises or worse. The worst is extreme famine, with half of these bodies being in Africa, or 73 million. While Afro-descendant peoples in Haiti continue to dwell with the fact that they live under an unnatural lockdown of extreme poverty and precarity. As you can see in this diagram, looking at the 10 worst hit countries from food crisis in 2019, at the top of the list, we have Yemen, which, as we know, has been embroiled in a major regional crisis in the Middle East. And then there is Haiti, our close neighbor, leader of the revolutionary struggles for freedom in the region, and certainly beset by multiple crises in which hunger and food insecurity is but one of them. The decisions that are taken now then will depend on, of course, the paradigms and theoretical frames that we embrace for this politics of global transformation and getting our food systems right. So let's review some non-conventional critical frameworks that I believe are important for illuminating the pathways for change. But before this, let me remind you of the traditional diagnostic on food crises. The traditional lens asserts that food systems are failing first because they do not produce and distribute enough to feed a growing world population. The traditional lens asserts that, do not produce enough to feed a growing world population. This standard mantra subtly locks our thinking into a modernist growth-centric paradigm and a monologic productivity efficiency discourse, which facilitates what I refer to here as saving clauses, magic bullets, and a sublime forgetfulness. The premise of lack represents the saving clause in the traditional diagnostic of food crises. Even if one shifts to a more nuanced view, such as Sen's food as freedom perspective, that reimagines lack as a deficiency of individual rights of entitlement given existing individual property rights or labor incomes. This value of a saving clause or lack is that it validates the direction set by modernist growth and market-centric development pathways. Starting from lack, we create the space for magic bullets to be invoked. That is, an endorsement of singular technological solutions or fixes that reinforce technological path dependency, or solutions that are driven by the profit-seeking imperatives in the corporate food regime. They appeal to magic bullet fixes like GMO golden rice to address vitamin A deficiencies versus increasing the consumption of carotene-rich foods like mangoes and green leafy vegetables, relies on this normalization of the dominant capitalist technological solutions. These magic bullets appeal to our intuitive attraction to technological progress as the human effort to eat a bread from the earth more efficiently and more abundantly is in our DNA. However, today's magic bullets, whether it be the green revolution of the 1960s or the gene revolution of today's contemporary agrobiotechnology, has a particular history and technological trajectory that supports agricultural research that has tended to overwhelmingly focus on increased productivity versus building the resilience of ecological and human health systems. The food crisis challenges encountered today reflect our heightened vulnerability to monocultural production systems designed to operate on the plantation logic of efficiency, scale, and control regimes. The extension and reproduction of these plantations and their logic requires for us to engage in a sublime forgetfulness of the nature of complex systems, as well as a history of modernization that has been rooted in racial states and a coloniality of power. In contrast then to the traditional lens on food systems, one can look to critical frames that are committed to a deeper analysis of the fault lines of crisis and to the right to say no to modernist growth-centric pathways that are invested in monologic, monocultural, and monodimensional or linear thinking, and all its accumulating wrongs reinforced by saving clauses, magic bullets, and a sublime forgetfulness. In contrast then, for example, Jason Moore sees the epicenter of this global food crisis in the global transformation of world ecologies and socio-political and economic systems through what he refers to as the Capitalocene. This concept is to be contrasted with that of the Anthropocene, introduced in 2000 by Crutzen and Stromer to announce a new geological epoch. It, however, has been criticized, as noted by Wendy Wolford, as a concept that is perhaps too abstract to deal with the role of humans in climate change, given that it treats humanity as an undifferentiated mass, undifferentiated by wealth, power, and race. For Jason Moore then, in his 2017 intervention, the Capitalocene speaks to a peculiar system of power, profit, and reproduction in the web of life. It allows one to examine the mode of organizing relations between humans and the rest of nature that cuts across the nature-human binaries. This concept treats with the longue durée of a capitalist ordering, seated in the complex socio-political, economic, and ecological conditions within feudalism that sought to circumvent endogenous uncertainties from climate and ecological systems in Europe as manifested in famines and poor harvests, and through a process of global expansionism sought to shore up its fragile socioeconomic transformations that would support capital accumulation. This globalization process in the Capitalocene, however, set off not only a metabolic rift with nature, but also a racialized political rift with existing non-European social forms of life. As such, this has led others, such as Davis et al., to call for the centrality of racial ordering of a racial ordering within the concept of the Plantationocene. In a 2019 essay in the Geographic Compass entitled Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and Plantationocene, a manifesto for ecological justice in an age of crisis, they place the emphasis on the logic of environmental modernization, homogenization, and control developed on historical plantations, as well as on the legacies of racial disordering. However, an even more forthright argument has been put forward by Catherine Yusuf for a recognition of 1 billion Black Anthropocenes. This concept bears witness not only to the deadly racial divisions accompanying capitalism, but also to the division between man and nature, man and matter, in the distinction between the human and the non-human, in which agency was expropriated from both nature and Black bodies. In this audience today, we can scarcely disavow the looming presence of the Caribbean and the Americas in the multiple naming of the Anthropocene to reflect the bodies, spaces, and times that were caught up, twisted, turned, broken, and dominated, given the racialized as well as gendered and class politics of what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. These conceptual frameworks do not simply name or speak to a historical process, but also point to key drivers that have transformed food into a global commodity, reshaping labor, production, reproduction, consumption, as well as land use practices, as first pointed out by Sidney Mintz in his 1985 epic, Sweetness and Power. These processes have continued within subsequent technological waves of global transformation, and as highlighted in texts such as the 2018 publication on Race and Rurality in the Global Economy, edited by Critchlow et al., and the 2018 edited volume and Geographies of Race and Food, edited by Slocum and Saldanha. These publications indicate that such socio-historical and power dynamics have tended to deepen the contradictions within rural and urban spaces and global and local food systems within the modern world system. Indeed, the contradictions within the modern food system abound. As Isabella Katziel remarked, the Green Revolution enabled food production to outpace population increases. But it was this very progress that contributed to large-scale land and water degradation, biodiversity losses, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the productivity of 23% of global land has declined, and about 75% of fresh water is used for agriculture. Moreover, she notes, and I quote, "Even if the climate crisis were miraculously solved tomorrow, agricultural production would still be racing down the path of unsustainability, failing to deliver diverse diets for all, income equality, or the health and well-being of the world's forests, soil, and water," end of quote. This point is dramatically reinforced by the 2020 paper in Nature Food by Johan Rockstrom et al., as they demonstrate that currently we are breaching planetary boundaries by our global food system. Thus, not only is the global food system the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world and the greatest cause of biodiversity loss, terrestrial ecosystem degradation, and waterway pollution due to the overuse of nitrogen and phosphorus, it is also the driver for unhealthy populations. In brief, sick food systems cause sick populations. As pointed out again by Rockstrom et al., and I quote, "Unhealthy food is the world's biggest killer, with diet-related chronic diseases estimated to be responsible for 11 million premature deaths in 2017 alone." While the 2019 Food and Nutrition Report of the FAO reminds us that globally, hunger is on the increase everywhere. This is pre-COVID. And the number of people with severe to moderate levels of food insecurity is now around 2 billion, with just under 900 million suffering from chronic hunger or acute food crisis. But as highlighted in yet another study in 2019, produced by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on cities and the circular economy for food, launched at Davos to promote reconnecting cities to local food production and supporting regenerative approaches to food production, that is, productive technology that improves overall health of ecosystems. In that study, they note that, and I quote, "Even when making healthy food choices, people's health is still being harmed by the way we produce food and deal with its byproducts. Among the harmful impacts of current food production methods are diseases carried by air pollution, water contamination, health consequences of pesticide use, and increased biological resistance. Leading causes of these include the overuse of fertilizer and the excessive reliance on antibiotics in animals," end of quote. In addition, even the senior livestock specialist at the World Bank's Agriculture and Global Food Practices Division, Franke Berth, in an interview in 2020 hosted on the World Bank's website, highlighted the fragility of the industrial mode of food production that has been exposed by COVID-19, and noted, drawing on a recent study, that, and I quote, 44 of the 60 largest meat, fish, and dairy companies, valued at US $244 billion, are considered high risk for pandemics, and none of them present low risk. Indeed, this senior World Bank official frankly stated that the paradox, and I open quote, "the paradox of industrialization of animal production does not reduce disease." Sorry, I'll repeat that. He stated frankly that the paradox of industrialization of animal production is that it does not reduce disease outbreaks. Indeed, the depth of the encroachment of agriculture, logging, mining, and other extractive industries on nature leaves us acutely vulnerable to infectious diseases like COVID-19, given the simple fact that these encroachments increase the prevalence of zoonotic diseases. That is, diseases that have their source in animals, whether domestic or wild. A relevant point of concern here for future global disease shocks is that 70% of emerging infectious diseases have their source in such animals. Finally, we must also recognize that the climate change, water, food, land, and environment nexus is now recognized to be an amplifier of social instability and is often the source for armed conflicts, as evident in particular in Yemen, the Middle East, and Africa. The link between food systems and peace and security, and between hunger and conflict, was recognized in a landmark UN Security Council resolution, Resolution 2417 in 2019. As highlighted by Laderack in his article, this resolution recognized the need to break the vicious cycle between armed conflict and food insecurity. In sum, globalizing hotspots of infectious diseases and pest outbreaks, fires, hurricanes, and floods, as well as violent conflicts, all today forcefully remind us then of just how precarious our current modern global food system is. But not just as a victim, rather as a virulent agent in these escalating problems. Yet in this context, the rush to biofuels only tends to concentrate power and amplify the threats to global food security. Moreover, a rush to liberal markets to ensure our food, as Tony Weiss has pointed out in a recent essay, will merely reinforce a perilous dependence on cheap food imports in the global south that has been fostered by decades of heavy debt, structural adjustment, and deepening market integration under the disciplines of the World Trade Organization. This situation of precarity in our states of food security is not reduced by liberalism, but rather it has been underpinned by the free market approach, which uses subsidized cheap industrial food surpluses to mask our food system vulnerability. This is a solution that has come up against four hard constraints. First, the current food system's biophysical contradictions. Second is biophysical limits, most notably tied to dependence on peak oil by the industrial food complex. Third, the growing and unsustainable levels of debt in the global south. And finally, an array of hidden and externalized environmental and social costs that implicitly buttress cheap industrial food. Rockstrom et al. Have noted that in a recent assessment of the hidden cost of food and land use systems is put at US $12 trillion, compared to the market value of the global food system at US $10 trillion. To see this another way, for every dollar now spent on food, society pays $2 in health, environment, and economic costs. Our Caribbean region faces all of these hard constraints in seeking to resolve our own food insecurity, which is mirrored in our high import bills, which is mirrored in our high and increasing food import bills. Our current income in 2015, the import bill for the CARICOM region was almost 5 billion US, and it is projected in a recent 2015 FAO report to increase to $8 or $10 billion in 2020. So the Caribbean region is also saturated in these modern food system contradictions, not just occurring at the global level, but also at the national and regional level. Unmasking these unsustainable resource and energy budgets, as well as the large ecological and atmospheric footprints, reveals inherent uncompetitiveness of industrial food monocultures relative to the low input and more diverse small farming systems, which are supported by agroecological perspectives. The narrative of superior yield and productivity per worker in plantation systems and in large farms or plantation production, modern industrial agriculture, this narrative of superior yield in these systems thus dismisses the tremendous real costs to the stability of our Earth systems and the future of humanity. Moreover, neoliberal processes and neoliberal bedrock institutions, such as the World Trade Organization, fundamentally reinforce these trends and contradicts the UN conventions guaranteeing the right to food. These biases in our current neoliberal and corporate controlled food systems thus mask not just food vulnerability, but also reproduce the conditions for structural inequality and structural violence through both past and present racialization processes that are endemic in our modern plantation systems and our industrialized food agricultural regimes. This is a situation that continues to leave the rural poor, who represent 75% of all poor, leave these rural poor globally and locally, not just suffering from food poverty, but also from land hunger. In transforming and transfiguring global and local food systems, then, traditional views of food security that reinforce plantational scenes by placing an emphasis on monocultural export-oriented food systems that are disarticulated from local economy, local community, and local ecological systems are simply not viable. In addition, traditional views that induce dependence on food surpluses from industrial agri-food complexes to meet domestic food requirements must be politically recalibrated, and the right to food must override the narrow profit considerations of the corporate food regime. New trade and bilateral aid and investment relations have to be fully cognizant of the need for planet-proofing the global food system and being vigilant against the racial, gendered, and classed geographies of food. To conclude, I would argue that in transforming and innovating for our food and agricultural systems, we must engage in 3D thinking. That is, divergent thinking, which relies on transdisciplinary perspectives, such as eco-nutrition and agroecology. Disruptive thinking, that is, thinking that undermines the hegemonic ordering of the neoliberal governmentalities over trade and food operated through the WTO or the IBRD, in order to pursue a more progressive agenda, such as the support for the 2018 UN Declaration for the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, that enshrines the principle of food sovereignty. And lastly, we need to engage in decolonial thinking, which requires an undermining of hegemonic epistemic orderings, the way we know things, the way we think things, and hegemonic narratives on efficiency and productivity, and move towards recentering the family farm, rural communities, as well as countering racial and colonial orderings of property, land, and bodies that facilitate the extractivist and expulsive logics of contemporary capital accumulation. Promoting a research agenda that centers 3D thinking, divergent, disruptive, and decolonial thinking, will support a vital transformation of our food systems that, as I have hoped to show, is failing us. This is the international consensus from practically every think tank that I have researched in examining this topic. So the Sustainable Rural and Agriculture Research Cluster will seek to promote 3D thinking to transform our food systems and also offer an important contribution to reparatory justice cause in unsettling geographies of race and food that underpin the crisis of global food systems in the plantation scene. Our research cluster will seek to do precisely this in a number of ways. Please allow me to wrap up this presentation then by pointing to our objectives and the work that we are doing to fulfill our mandate. So we have three main objectives. The first, to engage in creative and critical research projects, workshops, publications, etc., in order to promote a varied outreach and advocacy, as well as educational events, to support the well-being of rural people, their empowerment, and the transformation of rural lives and rural spaces. We will advance critical and decolonial agenda for a paradigm reset to realize secure rural futures and authentic development pathways. And we will engage rural stakeholders in the region and elsewhere for realizing these goals, in particular, with particular emphasis on zero hunger, good health and well-being, and decent work and growth, in line with the aforementioned objectives and in the context of the plantation scene. We have updated our membership, and we have a variety of youth, students, private sector, farmer networks, interdisciplinary and international researchers who are engaged with us, plus organizational affiliations. The SRAD agenda includes extending our reach through academic engagement, such as speaker series, projects, conferences, working groups. We are intended to publish a manifesto. We will have e-grounders, which will involve teaching and learning online. And we wish to mobilize efforts towards creating a rural trust, which will facilitate funds towards rural health engagement, research, and concrete support. Our speaker series, which I have launched today, will take place every Wednesday of the month. Our first 4 talks for this year. So our speaker series will continue until the end of this year. And then we'll have a new launch in 2022. But for the next 4 speakers, we will have discussions by a panel discussion on Afro-descendant seed infrastructures from dispossession to reparatory justice with Marissa Wilson from the University of Edinburgh, who has been the lead on that project. Sylvia Mitchell, who is the chair, moderator for this session. Myself, Talia Esnart, who is the dean, who is chair in the head in the Department of Sociology and Behavioral Sciences at the University of West Indies in St. Augustine, and Mr. Hugh Johnson, who is a farmer, the Bernard Lodge Farmers Group, as well as the second Vice Prime Minister of the State of African Diaspora. And that will take place on June the 2nd, 2020 at 9 a.m. The next speaker will be July the 7th, who will be a farmer looking at food security in Jamaica. And then we will close this particular group of talks before relaunching for the fall 2021, 2022 with Sylvia Mitchell, who would speak to positioning biotechnology to better serve Afro-descendant farmers and rural development in the Caribbean. So some of the projects that we've engaged in, subaltern seed stories, a participatory story map of Afro-descendants, seed savers. This has been a project proposal that we're working on developing currently. Another project that we're working on is towards anti-racist seed infrastructures, which we will speak to in the next speaker series in June. And we have a number of working groups that have been set up on the SRAD. And these groups here are just highlighted, looking at extractivism, epistemic violence, pedagogy for resisting rural othering, rural space reset, looking at rural youth dispossession in development, looking at food, dead food, health and food insecurity, looking at the relationships between food, health, disease, and ill-being. Food systems and technology innovation platforms, decolonial science, technology, and society studies. So for example, our seed infrastructures project is under working group 6. And we have a migration and food systems cluster working group, which is chaired by Talia Esnard, which looks at migrant labor and rural fragmentation in global food crises. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A section.
Thank you very much, Dr. Northover. You've given us a lot to think about. I can see the quality of the questions, that they want all the answers in one talk, but that's not going to be possible. I can see your 3D working already, because a big part of one of the problems that you've solved with Divergent is that we tend to keep the scientists and the social scientists and the economic separately. But what you've done is put everybody together, so that this is not a science think tank. This is not science. This is not social studies. This is making a difference. And I really thank you for bringing that out in your talk. We do have 2 questions in the Q&A. The first one is from Pambena Guto Basset, and there's about 3 questions in all. Would you like them separately, or do I, no, 4 questions, or do I read the whole paragraph?
You can just field the questions as you're given them, and I'll try my best to address them.
All right, so this is 4 different questions, so I will give them all in one batch, and then we can go on to the next questions as they come up.
I'd prefer to do it one at a time. Is that okay? Because
okay, they
might be
have
difficult
questions
to remember each one. So
okay,
let me
first,
start with the first one.
are there alternatives to industrialized agriculture and extractive industries?
Absolutely. Well, there wouldn't be a point to this discussion if there were no alternatives. And the question is really rebalancing the level of resources and attention paid to industrial monocropping systems, large-scale plantations, which through the variety of reports and studies that I highlighted are leading to ecological catastrophe, biodiversity loss, water degradation, increasing zoonotic diseases, poor health. The list is endless almost. So agriculture has been, and land use systems has been put into the limelight for its negative impact on sustainability, not
And I'm
only of the planet,
expecting,
but also the of human life. So in terms of alternatives, what we're looking at are small, think the opposite of plantation, right? So
right,
you're thinking of rather than monocultural, you're thinking of plurus,
permaculture,
permaculture, agroecology,
mhm,
instead of
organic,
large scale systems that what lead to deforestation, which is a driving cause for climate change, water degradation, etc. You're thinking about small plots. Currently, smallholders on less than 2 hectares contribute to approximately, in the FAO estimate, 70 to 80% of our food. So small farmers are already doing the work. The problem is that small farming has become more and more complicit with industrial agriculture, which is dependent on agricultural chemicals, fertilizers, which are non-regenerative. In other words, they affect the soil, the quality of the soil, they affect the quality of the water, they affect the quality of the nutrients that the plants produce. So what we need to do is go back to the way in which agriculture was managed through what we call plots, right? The small farming, biodiverse, intercropping, using organic or non-intensive methodologies for increasing yields. And the surprising fact is that small farmers in all the studies are shown to have a higher productivity per acre than larger farms. And Sir Arthur Lewis was one of those persons who was very critical of the plantation regime. And he said that no matter how much you increase the productivity of the plantation sector, you would not lead to an increase in decrease in poverty and decrease in poverty and increase in development, because
very good,
it's
very
an
good answer. Can
extractive,
I go to the next
it's an
one?
extractive sector. So
I,
yeah, the
there
answer is
are
that
alternatives.
we have alternatives based on looking at the differences between the plantation logic of large scale
And extractive
monocultural
logic. Mhm.
extractive industries, which are intensive and not sustainable.
What role can Caribbean governments play in transforming food systems?
Well, they have a huge role to play because they are responsible for the legal framework, the infrastructural framework that determines what are the possibilities and the conditions for production across the board. So take, for example, we don't have any policy on soil. We have a policy on soil health, but we have no legislative framework. We have a policy on food security, but we have no legislative framework. So if there are no legislative frameworks on the two most important things, which is your soil, the quality of your soil and food security, then how are you going to implement the the protection and well-being of your population? So no matter how much you want to talk about food and agriculture being on the agenda, if you're not legislating and implementing based on these criteria, which is looking at regenerative systems, to deal with the fact that we're in a global health crisis, a global food crisis, and there's absolutely no way forward with the industrial food system basically leading the way. We need to lead the way with what we know and what we have learned over the years through our own regenerative practices in small holdings. Let's scale those to an appropriate level so that we can have the kinds of sustainable outcomes in livelihoods and rural empowerment that we want. So
Number three.
the state has a lot to do with the conditions of structural inequality and violence that rural people experience. And so the buck stops with them in as an institutional and governance system. But fundamentally, the final voice must be sovereign peoples, that is democratic voice that tells governments what they want and directs and leads governments into the path that should be chosen. So we cannot rely only on our MPs. We have to take up the challenge and demand demand better in order to see a different world. So the
Okay,
onus
next
falls
one.
back on us, the people.
Sorry, I'm going to have to do this because there are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And we haven't finished the first four yet. Are they able to stand up in the face of the power of multinationals and the free market approach?
Absolutely. We've been fighting that. I don't know how many of you remember the slogan in Jamaica, IMF, okay, we are not for sale, right?
And
So
eat Jamaica, eat
yeah,
what you grow and grow what you eat.
exactly. So essentially the power always lies in the people. Just like in hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, we see that once a certain tipping point is reached and there is a sense of nausea and disgust at what is happening and what is being allowed to happen, people rise up, and they rise up in every generation under different circumstances to demand the right to life, the right to food, the right to eat, the right to decency, respect. So these are things that we have to fight for. They're not going to drop from the sky, as Bob Marley says, right? Some of us are waiting for somebody to come down on a cloud and deliver us. But even though we have faith, I think we also need to have practice. And the politics of decoloniality is that you resist colonial orderings wherever they are, whether they be global or local. So when our domestic governmental and regional organizations act in a colonial way, then we resist in the same way that we resist an imperial logic.
Faith without works is dead. So yes, we need to go that route. Okay, number 4. Are there options for comprehensive agrarian reform and debt cancellation that would provide a structural basis for the development of alternate food systems?
And that's a good question. And the fact is that we've been talking about debt restructuring, not only in the Caribbean, but at the global level. I mean, they've had very small efforts, like the highly indebted poor initiative to cancel debt. There was some cancellation for the very, very poor. You had the Jubilee, you've had some amounts of concessionary finances, but small states in the Caribbean faced a peculiar situation of being gradated because of an income criteria as to what constitutes developed and capacity. Now, given St. Vincent and the Grenadines, given Puerto Rico, given what is happening in Antigua and Barbuda, I mean, all the islands, they're always under a state of extreme vulnerability because of their ecological context, geological context, and their geopolitical context, right? So when something happens in the United States, the Caribbean with the global recession in 2007, it's taken us 5 years to recover from that. And then we're right back into the COVID pandemic, which is going to take us eons to recover, if we recover. And we don't really want to recover to go back to the same.
Right.
So this issue of a transformational agenda is on the policy agenda internationally already, even with the Inter-American, the OAS, Organization for American States. They've had a hemispheric agreement on agriculture and transformation. They've had meetings. I don't know how many meetings we're going to have on this issue of rural transformation and getting food systems right. So
Much
it's
food
on
for
the
thought.
agenda. The question
Yes.
is, how do you translate from talk, paper, blueprint, even policy? We have policy papers, but they're not being legislated, they're not being implemented, and they're not being resourced. So how do we deal with those issues? We need to deal with debt cancellation. We need to deal with reparatory justice, but we also need to do with radical global transformation if we want to stay on this planet alive.
Mm.
And agriculture is at the heart of the problem.
So, next question. Can you elaborate more on how the 3D thinking can inform policies to address some of these food security issues with emphasis on the Caribbean region?
Well, think about the way in which we think about resolving some of our problems. You always hear us, okay, we have a productivity crisis, but we have a productivity crisis within the region because we have a model of accumulation that's dependent on the racialization of bodies, making bodies cheap, making lives cheap, making resources cheap. You cannot afford to pay your workers. You cannot afford to pay your doctors. You cannot afford to pay your teachers. You can't pay. Who are you going to pay then if you don't pay these service workers who represent the heart and soul of your social infrastructure and your social economy? If your social economy disappears, you don't have an economy. So how can you continuously subsidize an economic system that reproduces itself with cheap labor, cheap bodies, and a cheapening of our land and our resources through extractivist activities? So the main goal is to say no to the devaluation of labor, no to the devaluation of land, no to the devaluation of the soil, no to the devaluation of our water, no to the devaluation of our health, of our essential workers. No, right? That is the first step. The decolonial step is a right to say no, that there is another way. And just because you are big and bad and powerful, it don't mean, say, as Bob Marley said, you may be a big tree, but I am a small axe. So I mean, it's second nature for Black people to resist injustice, but we're also very generous, right? We're citizens of suffering, right? We suck up a lot because we care.
Give away our information as if it was anything.
We don't necessarily in terms of a social movement erupt as angrily as we ought to, given the injustices suffered. But we have erupted in the 1930s. We erupted, right? We've erupted in the 1970s. We've erupted in the 1990s. So we're really a kind of walking time bomb, because the scale of violence that is happening across the region, but led by Jamaica, is an indication of the instability of our psyche, the instability of our systems, and the gross violence that has led to this whirlwind of violence that we're suffering from. So yeah, we need to be able to have more optimism and to stand up and say no in the decolonial agenda, to say no to what is wrong, to use divergent approaches and not this monologic. So one person has an answer, one theory has an answer.
One person has the
across
answer.
the board, right? And we're not talking to each other, right? So the humanities is not talking to the social sciences, the social sciences is not talking to the faculty of technology. And the problems are interdependent because we live in complex systems. So we must have divergent thinking. We must talk about
Thank God for Zoom.
Yeah, and we must be able to be disruptive. So when laws that are unjust are being perpetuated by World Trade Organizations, wherever they are, local or global, unjust laws cannot be obeyed.
Okay, we're going to have to go on because we won't get 100% for anyone, but you're doing very well so far. Okay, next one from Sonia Gatcher. Does your proposed solution of small-scale family farms advocate for the total abandonment of large-scale for-profit commercial agriculture, given that you have identified the deficiency and productivity are less than worthy goals?
Yeah, if somebody is big and bad and basically doing a lot of abuse and violence to systems, people, and processes, then obviously you have to stop. Yeah, I don't care if you think that you're being efficient. When you add the cost versus the benefits, you're not. For every dollar that we spend on food, there are $2 that we pay in environment, health, and economic
Right.
costs. So
You have to evaluate
obviously it's
fully.
unsustainable. It's a straight economic decision. Stop wasting money on structures, organizational structures that are like pouring money down a barrel that don't have no bottom, right? And the only reason that you keep doing that is because they represent the dominant view of what you need to do in order to keep going. Well, let us say, no, that's not the only view. And we can, not in an overnight situation, but we can also educate these larger companies and these larger transnationals to the alternatives in science
But I
and the
think you're also
alternatives in the dynamic of production. And I think that is an attempt that we see now in these whole discussions on the biome and the bioeconomy, sorry, which is supposed to be supportive of the biomes, which are these ecological systems that you need to treat with in an integral way. So that right now, the science and technology and all the reports are saying we need to shift gear. So if
right,
these large companies spend the money to shift gear, then all power to them. But they have to do it in such a way that they don't reproduce the structural inequalities, they don't reproduce the land grabbing, they don't reproduce the extractivism,
right.
they don't reproduce the deforestation. If they continue to do what they do, then the answer is that you don't have a role to play because you're not helping, you're hurting.
And I think the question said you identified that efficiency and productivity are less than worthy goals. I don't think you said that. I think you said that these smaller systems can be as efficient and productive, but they cannot be
No,
the
I said more
only
than
goal.
that. I said that the small scale agricultural systems in study after study are shown to be more efficient. Why? Because they're biodiverse. In other words, if your efficiency means that you lose everything except one thing, right? So you have 10 mangoes. And your efficiency means that in building, going from 10 mangoes to 20 mangoes, every other tree has to be cut down. So you only have mangoes to eat. That is not efficient. You're going to get sick from mangoes, right? So the point is inter, in interdependencies, right? So that if you think about what is necessary for the resilience of a system and the interdependencies that are required for making it work, then a monological, monocultural, and monodimensional view is wrong. In other words, anything that just have a one track that you can't break out of and you're locked into, so you can't think otherwise, is going to be debilitating to you.
In the long
Creativity
run.
requires diversity. And that's the law of the universe. That's not the law of me or anybody else. That's how the world was designed. That's how each person has their own thumbprint. Every country is different, right? So why is it that in agriculture, we're trying to standardize everything according to one platform and one model of efficiency that is killing us? So that notion of efficiency, which is so narrow-minded because it subordinates all the externalities and it subsidizes them, is wrong. So let us unearth the costs and the externalities and put it up front and say, okay, this is how
All
much
the
it
hidden
costs to
costs.
make it. So if it costs us 13 or what is it, 12 trillion is the cost of the global food system. What is the benefit? 10 trillion. There's a $2 trillion gap between the value of what we're doing and the cost of what we're doing. So somebody has to recalibrate, right? And
Next
I think
question.
those big players have to recalibrate. They have to listen to what is being said.
Okay, so next question. And I'll ask you to give this one short because I have a second part to it.
All
All
right.
right, so just a quick one. Can such farms provide sufficient food for the growing levels of urbanization and labor specialization observed? So we
Yeah,
have a
and that
high
was a point.
urban.
That was a point of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's study. She said that by 2050, 85% of people will be in cities. And so what
Right.
we need to do is have what she calls regenerative and circular economies of food. So rather than think about long distance global networks, we're thinking more of integrated rural urban, what they call now rubanomics, not urban development or rural development, but rural and urban put together. So you put R in front of urban and you get
Right.
ruban. It's very inventive, right? But it's what it's trying to say is that we need regenerative practices that allow us to get rid of the linear model, which just produces and doesn't do anything about what is being the byproducts and the waste, and that gets into negative externalities or sometimes positive. But the point is that you build circular systems. So it's your design model that needs to change, right, in order to get efficiency. Because right now, out of everything that we produce, these big corporations produce, and 40% of it is lost in waste, whereas 2% of it is lost in small farmer systems because they can't afford to waste anything.
And having a little vegetable patch behind
Right. So
is
the
good
waste,
for
the waste is
your mind as well, you know.
yeah, the waste is at the industrial level, not at the small farmer level. So if we can become as efficient as small farmers and not wasting stuff, in how they organize their production and intercrop and use the mulch and use everything that is in the plant for something and don't throw away. Those types of what they call integrated bioeconomies are much more effective in supporting productivity without hurting the environment. In other words, you don't have to clear any more forests in order to grow more food.
Okay, are you pessimistic that while technology contributes to the problem, that it will or could contribute solutions? So do you think technology can produce solutions, or it's just a problem?
Sylvia, that
That's
question
not
is
my
for you.
question.
I mean, why would we be here? We have one of the leading technologists in the region on plant and medicinal herbs, biotechnology. And what we're seeing is that there is no such thing as a single form of technology. So the way in which we think technology, so it's a magic bullet that we want to avoid, right?
Yes,
The one
exactly.
size fits all. This is a solution. Run with it. Don't care the consequences
One
because
pill and you don't have to
I
eat
have all the
anything else,
money and I have all
and
the
you'll
power
never
to
get
go to the
sick.
WTO and present them with an entire package. So how was TRIPS introduced in the WTO? Monsanto wrote the TRIPS agreement and introduced it with a batch of corporate lawyers, and the United States basically lobbied and had that as being, so no, you can patent life. That's not right. Right. And it's extractivism. It's this notion of bio-piracy that is one of the projects that we're working on, which is an appropriation of
Against, you mean?
resources, plant and plant material, the stuff that comes from traditional. People are just appropriating and patenting and say, okay, I have decided that this now belongs to me because it was already there in the commons. It was already there being shared. The technology was being innovated upon. How is it that you just come and grab everything and say that it now belongs to me because I have a patent on it? And the TRIPS methodology allows you to do that. So yeah, you can't reinforce those patterns of control and dispossession in moving forward. Technology should not dispossess. Technology should empower. So any technology that we have should be saying, what are the social impacts of this technology? We can't just, I think it was one of the sociologists says, we make the bomb, but we don't really care where it falls, you know? Scientists have a moral and social responsibility about what it is that they do. They are not disconnected from society. They are citizens of society. And that is a very dominant trend now, which is the democratization of science. That scientists cannot just do anything they feel like. There must be an evaluation of the social impact, the cost, the negatives, the positives, and it must be approved by democratic decision making. So if a particular technology is being pushed down your throat, you can say to that scientist, excuse me, you don't run my entire life. I have the right to say no, right? So that's the
That is
colonial
also
thinking.
loaded answer and question that we have to move on. Further is unbridled capitalism only perspective. Could there be a modified version of capitalism that could be more useful?
Absolutely. There's a tradition now, a research tradition that is called Archaeologists of Capitalism. And if you look at the world the World System Historical School coming out of Broadell SUNY University. That is a whole tradition that says that basically we're living in historical systems, so that capitalism is a word, right? But how markets work and how accumulation takes place is determined by particular kinds of historical formations, right? So that markets are things which can be shaped by social institutions. So you can have, just like how you have China doing its own thing with its version of market socialism, right? And America has its version of whatever it is it's trying to do, right? There are various forms of how it is that you build out these social formations, which markets are just one of them. Capitalism is simply another type of social formation that is amongst all the other forms that we could choose to pursue if we have different goals. But if you have something that is more market centric, that focuses largely on processes of commodification and objectification, then you have this kind of rampant capitalism, which is the worst form of capitalism, if you want. So you have varieties of market systems, you have varieties of capitalism. And just like Sweden has found a variety that perhaps works for it, we have to find a variety that suits us given our history or culture and given the nature of the impacts on the global system. So we can't just, as us, the closing remark from the article I was quoting a lot from on Planet Proof in the System, Global Food System, closes by saying that before we used to say you need to think local, think global and act local. No, we can't think like that anymore, right? We need to understand that there's an interdependent system, and therefore our actions count in determining how it is that that system overall functions, right? So we need to have much more dynamic system modeling of the interactions between different spaces and geographies and what kind of implications that those have in order to make sensible decisions about how it is that we plan our markets, organize our markets, and sustain our markets, which I think is what capitalism is about, the extension of a certain form of market civilization, that we need to change the civilizational character of it so that it's really civil. And then we can talk about maybe capitalism 2.0, a different form in a different world, because as it is now, it is killing us.
Okay, I have 3 more questions here. The first one is from Jevon Henry. Wonderful presentation, Dr. Northover. This is really food for thought. How might the message of food sovereignty best be promoted among Caribbean people, given the vulnerabilities to natural hazards faced by SIDS and perception of farming as risky?
Right. So this is the paradigm reset we need, right? So if we look at agriculture and we see that the persons who get all the money, who get all the capital, who get all the subsidies, etc., are the ones who are hurting the planet, and the ones who are actually feeding us and who are keeping the biodiversity, whatever is left of it is because of the small farmers keeping it alive. If we were to pump 1/4 of the resources to those modes of social organization of how we produce and eat food, regenerative systems, then we'd have a revolution and the money would flow towards it, right? Because it would give you healthy diets, healthy people, healthy ecologies, healthy farms, healthy households, less domestic violence, less criminality, you name it. It would just, all the studies show the inherent relationship between food, hunger, and conflict. Malnourished children have problems in terms of learning, right? Psychological problems emerge if you can't eat enough, right? So that how can you feed your brain if you're not eating right? And if your brain is malfunctioning and you're having all of these psychological disorders, right? Because you're chronically suffering from malnutrition of one form or the other based on your diet of processed foods or your diet from the industrial corporate regime, food regime, then you will end up having dysfunctional bodies, dysfunctional people, dysfunctional families, and dysfunctional societies. So this is why food, was considered to be the basis on which we became human. It defines what it means to be. Agriculture was what allowed us to define our humanity, right? So when agriculture goes wrong, the system is at its limit point, right? So this is why Ostrom was saying that the most important thing is that we need to get our food systems right, because as it is now, the mode of organization, the kind of inequalities and violences that is reproducing, just running ahead, as the quotes that I use. I mean, even if the climate crisis was miraculously solved, agriculture was still paralleling down the hill to nowhere. So we need to basically put the brake and say, let us value those things that need to be valued. Let us value those bodies that need to be valued, those communities, those households. Let's empower them. Let's give them the resources. Let's make them the entrepreneurs that they already are, but better ones, because we're now doing the science that is helping them, not just discounting them and calling dirty people and subsistence. We need to get away from subsistence. I'm so tired of hearing people talk about subsistence farm as if it's some low-tech farming. It's one of the most sophisticated forms of farming that there exists. So we need to basically valorize what we already have and put the resources into those pockets that can make the difference to keep us healthy and keep us non-violent.
Yeah. Okay, so Moali has the last two questions that I have here. First is, what political system or systems is best suited for facilitating food sustainability? From the
Democratic ones.
presentation, I am seeing nationalism and socialism coming out.
No, democratic spaces where you have the right to choose. Any space that tells you that you have to listen to somebody else and he don't give up when he comes and then leaves and everything is messed up, no accountability, right? And he can decide the rules of the game and call all the shots. If somebody is behaving like a tyrant and instituting laws that lock you in to a regime that is locking you down, and you get up and say no and them shoot you. I mean, environmental activists are the most murdered activists in the entire planet. If you look at any other form of activism, environmental activists are being killed left, right, and center. Why? Simply because they're saying no. So it's not a simple thing. Democracy is something where you have the right to choose, but doing it in a way that you can institute your own form of legal organization that expresses your will in a way that's consistent with your life choices, your livelihood choices, so that having less racial states, having less colonial states, having anything that is more tyrannical and kind of just pushing you. I mean, just like in your family, if you have parents who just locking you down and telling you me know everything and me must decide for you. No, democracy means that you listen and you value. And then you have a debate. Instead of the monologic, we move to the dialogic, right? We start, we move from this one voice, one narrative to the voices, right? I mean, in the critical literature, they're calling it the pluriversal, right? That many voices, many forms out there that need to have an anchoring in democratic institutions and democracies, which are not simply compromises, right? Because we know America is a democracy, but it's a compromised, corrupt democracy. So democracies that are corrupt are not genuinely healthier democracies. So just like if you have corrupt soil, you cannot grow good plants. If you have a corrupt democratic space, you cannot grow healthy voice. So the corruption has to be something that everybody takes seriously. Corruption at the high level, at the medium level, at the low level, international, regional, global, and take it seriously, because that is what is killing your voice. That's what's killing your future. So democracy is the only option, I think, but democracies which are genuine and authentic.
Okay, and the last question. Interesting questions these are indeed. Are there any colonial practices that are feasible enough to be kept or retained?
Yes and no. I think one of the ones that is interesting is this idea about conservation and botanical gardens. But the way in which the colonial practices worked was that they came to our gardens, stole everything and took it back to their
Yeah.
gardens and then told us we couldn't access it because it's now theirs. Just like the museums, right? They took your art and then put it up in their place and they said, okay, it's ours. You don't own it anymore. Well, where did he get it from? Right? But it's a good practice to conserve. It's a good practice to know your biodiversity and to have botanical gardens and to have all of these scientific practices towards understanding botany, understanding plant species, knowing your flora and your fauna, knowing your soil, all of these things. This imperative to know, right? This will to improve, this technological dynamism that is there, even with coloniality, is fine. It's just that technological dynamism which rapes, exploits, dispossess, so that if you use it, if just like a gun, right? If you use your gun to shoot down everybody else and haul up all the money for yourself, right? Then that technology is bad. But if you use your gun because somebody is coming to attack or kill your family, and you pull out your gun and say, no, that not happen on my watch, then obviously that gun as a technology is defensive and protective of certain rights. So the technology is based on the social framework in which it's embedded. So there's no technology in the abstract. Every technology serves a purpose. And if it's not serving the purpose that it is supposed to be designed for, which is to sustain life, humanity on the planet, if it is killing us, then I don't care if you want to say that, technology is good. Technology is not good in a vacuum. Technology is good based on how it is used. Just like digital technology, right, can be used in ways that are inimical to our well-being, right? And we have to be careful of just jumping on a technological, the path dependency I was talking about. You can't just jump in something because there's a river running by you and you feel so you're going to get left. No, think about it. Where is the river going? Is it going off a cliff? Is there not, did the river detour at any point earlier on that led to a nice forest area where you could go chill out?
Right.
Yeah, well, go and follow that detour. Maybe that detour on that same river will take you to a better place than the rush that is going to take you over the cliff. So technology needs to be intelligently handled, critically discoursed. So innovation systems are the lifeblood of all human beings, but it's not monopolized by anyone. And if it starts to become a monopoly, again, tyranny, if technological choices become refused because one person owns all the patents and one person says, no, you can't have this. So monopoly power in technology is a very dangerous thing, even though some aspect of monopoly power must be there in terms of being able to give certain rights and control, to give incentives to innovate. So that one of the things that is absent from the WTO is a competition policy. Why? Because it would break up big corporations. Right? So that they refuse to have a competition policy and they say, okay, the free market will work. Yeah, it will work because the playing ground is not level. So it will work for some people, but will continue to dispossess others. So that's why they don't want competition law in the WTO.
I'm
And they
left
don't
with
want it.
two.
They don't want it in the FTA, the free trade area. They don't want it in the regional trade agreements. Why?
Right.
Because it's something that would empower smallholders. Because competition means that the big man can't squeeze out the small man all the time.
Thank you so much. I have two comments left from Jevon Henry. He says, thanks much for your response. And Sherry Foundation says, thank you for such excellent presentation out of the Bahamas.
Hey, big up Bahamas.
Dacia Leslie says, excellent presentation. I think this is a good introduction to the SRAD and what we're trying to do to present the problems as well as solutions and to talk about these issues that have been brought up today. We are recording this session and it will be on the SRAD website by SALISES, and we will continue to do that. And as well as presentation, I expect that we will have some discussion times as well between all the SRAD participants. So can I turn this over to the person who will do the vote of thanks?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. It's just left for me now to say thank you to everybody who made this uh, talk such a success. Thanks to the speaker, Dr. Northover. Thanks to you, Sylvia. Thanks to Richard. Thanks to Christina. Thanks to Orion and everyone who participated. Thanks in particular to the audience who posed such interesting questions. We'll see you at the next talk. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for your time and attention. I do appreciate all the support I was given, especially by Christina, who got pulled in to help me steady my nerves that everything would go right. I want to thank everyone for really the wonderful support that made this possible.